Did Marie Antoinette really say, "Let them eat cake"? You've probably heard it before. A young, rich queen sitting in a palace far from the struggles of ordinary people, hearing that her subjects have no bread, and casually responding, "Let them eat cake." It's one of the most famous quotes in history, and also one of the most misleading, because the truth is, there is no solid evidence that Marie Antoinette ever said it at all. But if she didn't say it, why does almost everyone believe she did? To understand that, we need to go back to 18th century France, a time of extreme inequality, political tension, and growing anger toward the monarchy. Marie Antoinette was born in 1755, an Austrian archduchess, later married into the French royal family at just 14 years old. She became Queen of France when she married King Louis XVI, and almost immediately, she became the target of public criticism. But not just criticism, propaganda. Because in pre-revolutionary France, public opinion was already turning dangerous. The country was drowning in debt. Food prices were rising. Bread, the most basic survival food, was becoming unaffordable for many families. And when people are starving, they don't just look for solutions. They look for someone to blame. That's where Marie Antoinette entered the story. She was young, foreign, wealthy, and lived in Versailles, a palace so luxurious it looked completely disconnected from the suffering outside its gates. And over time, she became a symbol, not necessarily of what she did, but of what people believed the monarchy represented. Indifference, carelessness, privilege without understanding. But here's where things get interesting. The phrase, "let them eat cake," didn't even originate with her. In fact, versions of this story existed long before Marie Antoinette was even born. One of the earliest known versions appears in the writings of philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau. In his autobiography, he describes a great princess who, when told that peasants had no bread, replied, "Let them eat brioche." Brioche is not cake as we think of it today. It's a rich, buttery bread, still expensive, but not quite cake. And even then, Rousseau does not attribute this story to Marie Antoinette. In fact, when he wrote it, she was just a child. So the quote existed, but it was floating in political literature as a kind of moral example of aristocratic ignorance. Over time, that idea became more and more exaggerated. And then came the French Revolution. That's when everything changed. Because during revolutions, stories matter as much as facts. And Marie Antoinette had become the perfect symbol. A queen who supposedly didn't care if people starved, a monarchy out of touch with reality, a system that had to be destroyed. So pamphlets, rumors, and revolutionary propaganda began spreading stories about her. And somewhere in that storm of anger and political messaging, the "let them eat cake" quote was pinned onto her name, even though there is no record of her ever saying it. Not in court documents, not in letters, not in eyewitness accounts, nothing. But by the time truth tried to catch up, the story had already become more powerful than reality. And that's how myths are born. Not always from lies, but from repetition, from emotion, from a society looking for a face to represent its suffering. And Marie Antoinette became that face. But to really understand whether she deserved that reputation, we need to go deeper. Into her life inside Versailles, her personality, her political mistakes, and the growing storm that would eventually lead to revolution and her execution. Because the truth is far more complicated than a single sentence ever could be. And the story is just beginning. Did Marie Antoinette really say, "Let them eat cake"? To understand why Marie Antoinette became one of the most hated queens in history, we need to step inside Versailles, not just as a palace, but as a symbol. Because Versailles was not simply a royal residence. It was a world of its own. A carefully constructed universe of etiquette, ceremony, and distance. And at the center of it stood Marie-Antoinette, a young woman suddenly placed into a role she was never fully prepared for. When she arrived in France as a teenager, she was immediately surrounded by expectations. She was not just becoming a wife to Louis XVI. She was becoming the Queen of France. A public symbol. A political instrument. A figure everyone would interpret, judge, and reshape according to their own fears and hopes. At first, she tried to adapt. But Versailles was suffocating in its own way. Every movement was observed. Every dress was noted. Every decision became a statement. Even something as simple as choosing friends or spending time alone was interpreted politically. Anne Marie-Antoinette, being young and raised in a more informal Austrian court, struggled with this environment. So she did what many people in strict systems do when overwhelmed. She created her own small world inside the larger one. A private retreat. A space away from formal rituals. A place where she could breathe. But outside Versailles, France was changing rapidly. The country was sinking into financial crisis. Wars had drained the treasury. Taxes were heavy. And the burden fell mostly on peasants and the poor. Bread prices rose. Hunger spread. And frustration turned into anger. But the public did not see the internal complexity of the monarchy. They saw symbols. Anne Marie-Antoinette quickly became one of them. Because she was visible. She wore fashion that stood out. She spent money in ways that seemed excessive to a starving population. And most importantly, she was foreign. That mattered more than people today might realize. In a time of crisis, outsiders often become convenient explanations for deeper systemic problems. And so a narrative began forming. That she was careless. That she was indifferent. That she did not understand suffering. But history is rarely that simple. Many of the stories about her spending and behavior were exaggerated or taken out of context. Versailles itself had always been expensive, long before her arrival. The monarchy was already built on enormous financial structures that had nothing to do with one individual queen. Yet Marie-Antoinette became the face of it. Because narratives need characters. And hers was the most visible. Pamphlets began circulating in Paris. Some were political critiques. Others were outright scandalous fiction. They portrayed her not just as a distant queen, but as a symbol of corruption. Some even attacked her personally in ways that went far beyond politics. And these stories spread faster than facts ever could. Because they were emotional. And during times of crisis, emotional stories travel faster than truth. Inside Versailles, she may have seen herself as a woman trying to live a constrained royal life. Outside Versailles, she was becoming something else entirely. A symbol of excess. A representation of inequality. A reason for anger. And slowly, without a single confirmed statement or recorded quote, the idea of her saying, "Let them eat cake," began attaching itself to her image. Not because she said it, but because people needed her to have said it. It fit the story too perfectly. A disconnected queen. A starving population. A cruel, careless response. Even though the real monarchy system was far more complex, involving ministers, finances, and centuries of political structure, the human mind simplifies chaos into stories that are easier to understand. Anne Marie-Antoinette became part of that simplification. But what's important here is this. Her image was not created overnight. It was built slowly, through rumor, through pamphlets, through public frustration, through political manipulation, and through repetition. By the time she was aware of how deeply she was disliked, it was already too late to reverse it. Because once a public identity is formed, it becomes stronger than the person it describes. And in France, that identity was hardening into something dangerous. A villain. A scapegoat. A symbol of everything wrong with the system. But revolutions don't happen because of symbols alone. They happen when symbols are attached to real suffering. And as France moved closer to revolution, the distance between the monarchy and the people would become impossible to ignore. And Marie-Antoinette would find herself standing at the center of it. Not because of a cake, but because of a country ready to explode. And the explosion was coming. By the time France was on the edge of collapse, the story of Marie-Antoinette had already begun transforming into something far more powerful than historical fact. It was no longer just about a queen. It was about what she represented. And in revolutionary France, representation mattered more than truth. As the financial crisis deepened, anger in Paris turned into organized political action. The monarchy was no longer seen as just distant. It was seen as responsible. And in that environment, words became weapons. Pamphlets flooded the streets of Paris. Cheap, fast, and impossible to control, they carried political messages, rumors, and exaggerated stories about the royal family. Some were written by revolutionaries. Some were anonymous. Some were simply sensationalist. But they all had one thing in common. They needed a clear villain. And Marie-Antoinette became that figure. Not because she issued policies, but because she was visible, symbolic, and easy to target. The phrase, "let them eat cake," started gaining strength in this atmosphere, not as a verified quote, but as a political metaphor. It perfectly captured what revolutionaries wanted people to believe about the monarchy, that the ruling class was so disconnected from suffering that they could respond to hunger with ignorance or cruelty. Even though earlier versions of the story existed in European literature long before her time, this was the moment when the phrase became politically useful. And once something becomes useful in propaganda, it spreads quickly. Because propaganda does not need proof. It needs repetition. As tensions escalated, events moved rapidly toward revolution. In 1789, the storming of the Bastille marked the beginning of the French Revolution. Power was shifting away from the monarchy and toward revolutionary assemblies. But revolutions are not only political events. They are emotional transformations. And during emotional transformations, symbols become more important than individuals. Marie-Antoinette was no longer just a queen living in Versailles. She was becoming a symbol of everything the revolution opposed: privilege, inequality, and perceived indifference. And at this stage, the quote, "let them eat cake," became fully attached to her identity in the public imagination. Not through evidence, but through association. Pamphlets and revolutionary writings began repeating the idea in increasingly direct forms. Over time, variations of the phrase were explicitly attributed to her, even though earlier sources never connected it to her personally. And this is how historical myths lock in. First, a story exists in abstract form. Then it gets attached to a symbolic figure. Then it is repeated during moments of crisis. And finally, it becomes common knowledge. By the time anyone asks for proof, the belief is already too widespread to question. Even people who knew the monarchy had complex political structures still repeated the story because it communicated something emotionally true about inequality, even if it was factually false. And that emotional truth mattered more than accuracy. Meanwhile, inside France, the revolution was intensifying. The monarchy was being stripped of authority step by step. The royal family was placed under increasing restrictions. Public trust was collapsing. And Marie-Antoinette, once a queen of luxury and ceremony, was now a prisoner of political change. But her image outside the palace walls had already been fixed. She was no longer just a person. She was a narrative. And narratives are difficult to undo once they reach critical mass. Even as historians later examined records, letters, and testimonies, they found no credible evidence that she ever said the phrase attributed to her. But by then it didn't matter. because the phrase had already outlived its origin. It had become part of history not as fact, but as symbol. And symbols, once established, rarely disappear. They evolve. And in the case of Marie Antoinette, the evolution would continue all the way to the most tragic ending of her life. Because the revolution was not slowing down. It was tightening its grip. And soon, the queen who never said those words would face judgment from the very nation that believed she did. Did Marie Antoinette really say, "Let them eat cake"? By the time Marie Antoinette entered the final chapter of her life, the world around her had already been completely transformed. The monarchy she once belonged to was collapsing. The revolution was no longer a movement. It was a system of power. And symbols, once created, were now being punished. Marie Antoinette was arrested and imprisoned after the royal family attempted to flee France in 1791. That failed escape destroyed what little public trust remained in the monarchy. From that moment on, she was no longer seen as a queen in exile. She was seen as an enemy of the revolution. She was held first in the Temple prison in Paris, separated from her children and husband, under constant surveillance. The woman who once lived in the luxury and strict etiquette of Versailles was now living in silence, isolation, and fear. Meanwhile, the political climate outside was becoming more extreme. The French Revolution had entered its most dangerous phase. The monarchy had been abolished. France had become a republic. And revolutionary leaders were now deciding what to do with those who represented the old system. That included King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. Louis XVI was executed first in January 1793. His death marked a turning point. Because after a king is executed, a queen cannot simply remain a political prisoner. She becomes a symbol that must also be resolved. In October 1793, Marie Antoinette was brought to trial before the Revolutionary Tribunal. But this was not a trial in the modern sense of justice and evidence. It was a political process shaped by revolution, fear, and public anger. She was accused of multiple charges: treason, depletion of national resources, conspiracy with foreign powers, and moral corruption. Many of these accusations were either exaggerated or impossible to prove in any strict legal sense. But the goal of the trial was not careful historical accounting. It was closure for a revolution that needed to fully separate itself from the past. During the trial, she defended herself with dignity under extreme pressure. Witnesses later described her as composed, even in moments of humiliation. But the outcome had already been decided. She was found guilty and sentenced to death. On October 16, 1793, she was taken to the guillotine in Paris. Her final journey was public. Crowds gathered not to mourn, but to witness the final act of a political transformation. And with her execution, the last visible connection to the old monarchy was removed. But something else happened after her death. Her image did not disappear. It evolved again. Because myths do not end with the people they are attached to. They continue living through memory. The phrase, "let them eat cake," still widely associated with her, continued to circulate long after her execution. But historians began doing what propaganda never does: investigating. They traced the origins of the phrase back to earlier European writings, including the works of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, where a great princess is quoted saying a similar line decades before Marie Antoinette even became queen. They examined court records, personal letters, memoirs, and contemporary accounts from the revolution itself. And what they found was consistent. There is no credible historical evidence that Marie Antoinette ever said, "Let them eat cake." Not in official documents. Not in eyewitness testimony. Not in her own correspondence. In other words, the most famous quote attributed to her is almost certainly false. So how did it survive? Modern historians explain it as a combination of factors. First, Political propaganda during the French Revolution needed symbolic figures to represent inequality. Second, Marie Antoinette was already a convenient target due to her status, nationality, and visibility. Third, the phrase itself was too perfect. It captured the emotional narrative of class divide in a single sentence. And finally, repetition ensured survival. Once a story enters public memory, it no longer depends on accuracy. It depends on usefulness. Over time, even textbooks and popular culture repeated the phrase without checking its origin, further cementing the myth. Today, historians treat it as a classic example of historical misattribution, a statement that feels true emotionally but lacks factual grounding. And ironically, the myth tells us more about the revolution than it does about Marie Antoinette herself. It tells us how societies construct villains, how language shapes memory, and how easily a symbolic sentence can outlive reality. So did she say it? Almost certainly not. But the fact that people believed she did says something deeper about the world she lived in and the revolution that followed. Because in history, truth is not always what survives. Sometimes, the story is stronger than the person. And in the case of Marie Antoinette, that story became immortal, even when she did not say a single word of it. Fall of the monarchy, when a queen becomes a symbol of a collapsing world. By the time France reached its breaking point, the life of Marie Antoinette was no longer defined by Versailles, fashion, or court politics. It was defined by collapse. The French monarchy was not suddenly destroyed. It unraveled step by step under the weight of financial crisis, political pressure, and public unrest that had been building for decades. And by the early 1790s, the unraveling had reached its final stage. The revolution had already changed everything. Power was no longer centered in the palace. It was shifting into new political bodies in Paris. The monarchy still existed in name, but in reality, it was becoming powerless. And in this environment, Marie Antoinette was no longer treated as a queen in any meaningful sense. She was treated as a political problem that needed resolution. Her husband, Louis XVI, attempted to maintain authority, but every move he made was now constrained by revolutionary oversight. Trust in the monarchy had already been broken, and once trust collapses in politics, authority becomes symbolic rather than functional. The royal family's attempt to escape France in 1791, known historically as the Flight to Varennes, was a turning point that sealed their fate. They were captured before reaching safety, and the moment they were brought back to Paris, everything changed. Because now, the monarchy was no longer seen as simply ineffective. It was seen as disloyal. From that moment onward, the idea of compromise disappeared from political discussion. The revolution moved toward complete restructuring of the state. And Marie Antoinette's position changed again. She was no longer just a queen. She became a hostage of history. Inside Paris, revolutionary leaders began dismantling royal authority. Piece by piece, the monarchy was formally abolished in 1792, and France declared itself a republic. This was not just a political shift. It was an identity shift. France was trying to redefine itself completely. And in doing so, it needed to separate itself from everything associated with the old regime. That included institutions, titles, and individuals. Marie Antoinette was arrested shortly after the monarchy was abolished. She was imprisoned in the Temple Tower, isolated from the world she had once lived in. The transformation was extreme. A woman who had once lived in one of the most controlled and ceremonial environments in Europe was now living in confinement, stripped of authority, separated from her family, and under constant surveillance. But her symbolic role had not diminished. If anything, it had intensified. Because revolutions do not only remove power, they redefine guilt. And as political tensions escalated in revolutionary France, leaders needed accountability for the suffering and instability of the past. That is where symbolism becomes dangerous, because symbols are easier to punish than systems. Anne Marie-Antoinette had become the most visible symbol of the old order, not necessarily because she was uniquely responsible for France's problems, but because she represented them in the public imagination. At this stage, the famous phrase, "let them eat cake," was already fully embedded in popular discourse about her, even though it had no verified historical origin tied to her. It functioned not as a quotation, but as a narrative summary. A way of compressing decades of economic inequality, resentment, and political frustration into a single imagined moment of indifference. And once a narrative becomes that useful, it stops needing evidence. The monarchy itself had now been replaced, but instability did not end. Instead, it intensified. France entered what would later be known as the Reign of Terror, a period where revolutionary justice became increasingly severe and politically charged. During this time, former members of the monarchy were not just imprisoned, they were systematically tried as enemies of the revolution. Marie Antoinette's trial would follow. But before that moment arrived, something else had already been decided. Her identity in history was no longer negotiable. Because in the logic of revolution, once a symbol is assigned meaning, it rarely gets reinterpreted in real time. It gets enforced. And enforced narratives are stronger than individual truth. By the time she stepped into her final phase of life, the outcome had already been shaped not just by courts or laws, but by years of storytelling, propaganda, and collective emotion. And that is what makes her story unusual. Not because of what she did, but because of what history decided she represented. Trial, imprisonment, and execution, the final days of a queen. By the time the final chapter of Marie Antoinette began, France was no longer the country she had entered as a teenager. It was something entirely new. The monarchy had fallen. The old political order had been dismantled. And in its place stood a revolutionary government determined to redefine justice itself. Marie Antoinette was no longer living in Versailles, no longer surrounded by ceremony, servants, or royal protocol. She was imprisoned inside the Temple Tower in Paris. Her environment was reduced to confinement, surveillance, and silence. Her family was separated from her under increasingly strict conditions. Her children were taken away first, a decision that became one of the most emotionally devastating aspects of her imprisonment. Her husband, Louis XVI, had already been executed months earlier, leaving her isolated not only politically but personally. Inside the prison, there were no royal rituals left. No titles that carried power. No court that responded to her presence. Only guards, walls, and waiting. Meanwhile, outside the prison, France was undergoing one of the most intense political phases in its history. The revolutionary government was consolidating authority through fear and legal restructuring. The Revolutionary Tribunal had been created to process individuals considered enemies of the state. Anne Marie-Antoinette was placed at the center of that system. Her trial began in October 1793. But it was not a trial in the modern sense of neutral investigation or balanced legal defense. It was a political process shaped by revolutionary urgency. She was accused of multiple charges: treason against the state, conspiracy with foreign powers, depletion of national resources, and moral corruption of the monarchy. Many of these accusations were based on political interpretation rather than concrete evidence. But in the context of revolution, evidence was often secondary to perceived necessity. The goal was not to debate whether she had personally caused France's suffering. The goal was to define the past in a way that justified the present. During the proceedings, Marie Antoinette maintained a composed presence under extreme pressure. Witness accounts describe her as controlled, restrained, and determined not to collapse emotionally in public. The courtroom itself was not designed for neutrality. It was shaped by revolutionary ideology, public expectation, and political tension. Every question, every accusation, every response was part of a larger narrative already in motion. And that narrative had been forming long before the trial began. For years, pamphlets, rumors, and political propaganda had already defined her in the public imagination. The idea that she represented excess, indifference, and aristocratic detachment had been widely circulated. This included the famous phrase, "Let them eat cake," which by this point had become fully attached to her identity in popular belief, even though no verified historical evidence connected it to her directly. In the courtroom, however, historical accuracy was not the central issue. Symbolic accountability was. The revolution was not only removing a monarchy, it was redefining moral order. Anne Marie-Antoinette represented, in the public mind, the old system that had to be judged. The trial concluded with a guilty verdict. The sentence was death. After the verdict, she was transferred back into confinement to await execution. Her final days were marked by isolation and anticipation. Historical accounts suggest she remained composed, though clearly aware of what was coming. There is a quiet difference between not knowing your fate and knowing it is already decided. And she lived in the second condition. On October 16, 1793, she was taken from her cell early in the morning. She was no longer dressed in royal clothing. There were no ceremonies, no symbols of monarchy, no public display of status. She was escorted through Paris in a cart, a public procession meant not for celebration, but for visibility. Crowds gathered along the streets, not to witness a queen, but to witness the end of a symbol. At the place of execution, the guillotine stood as the final instrument of revolutionary justice. Marie Antoinette stepped forward in silence. Witnesses later described her final moments as composed, without dramatic speech or collapse. She reportedly showed calm dignity in the face of death. And then, the execution was carried out. With that moment, her life ended. But her historical identity did not. Because in many ways, her execution was not the end of her story. It was the beginning of her transformation into myth. And myths, once created, do not stay fixed in time. They evolve. They simplify. They become detached from the complexity of real lives. Anne Marie-Antoinette would soon become one of history's most famous examples of that process. Not because of what she said, but because of what people needed her to represent. And what came next would determine how the world remembers her even today. The afterlife of a myth, how "let them eat cake" became fake history. After the execution of Marie Antoinette, history did not pause. It reassembled her. Because once a public figure becomes a symbol, death does not end their story, it only freezes the moment in which they are easiest to interpret. And for Marie Antoinette, that frozen image was already forming long before historians began their work. The phrase, "let them eat cake," which had been fully attached to her identity during the French Revolution, continued to circulate across Europe and beyond. But as time passed, something changed. Historians began asking a simple question. Where did this actually come from? And the deeper they looked, the more the story began to fall apart. They found that the earliest version of the idea did not belong to Marie Antoinette at all. Instead, a similar anecdote appears in the writings of philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, where a great princess is described as responding to the idea that peasants had no bread by suggesting they eat brioche. But even in that version, there is no connection to Marie Antoinette. The story predates her prominence in French political life. This detail matters because it reveals something important about how historical myths form. They rarely begin with one invention. They begin with repetition of older ideas. Then those ideas are reassigned to figures who later become politically useful. By the time of the French Revolution, Marie Antoinette had already become a symbolic target. Pamphlets, political writings, and public discourse had transformed her into a representation of aristocratic excess and detachment. And in that environment, the cake story was too perfect to resist. It captured everything revolutionaries wanted to express in a single sentence: inequality, ignorance, and the distance between rulers and the ruled. So it spread. Not because it was proven, but because it was effective. And once a story becomes effective, it no longer needs verification to survive. It only needs repetition. Over time, the phrase became detached from its origin entirely. It stopped being a political metaphor and started being treated as a historical fact. It appeared in books, speeches, educational materials, and popular retellings of the French Revolution. And each repetition strengthened the illusion of authenticity. This is how historical myths stabilize. Not through evidence, but through cultural reinforcement. Modern historians, however, operate differently. They examine primary sources, letters, court records, eyewitness accounts, and contemporaneous writings from the period. And across all of these sources, there is a consistent absence of evidence that Marie Antoinette ever said the phrase attributed to her. There is no verified testimony from her contemporaries confirming it. No documented speech. No personal writing suggesting it. Nothing in the historical record supports the attribution, which leads to a clear conclusion in modern scholarship. The quote is almost certainly false. But the more interesting question is not whether she said it. It is why people believed she did. Because the persistence of the myth reveals more about society than about her. It reveals how political environments shape memory. It shows how propaganda works not just in moments of revolution, but across centuries. And it demonstrates how human psychology simplifies complexity into narrative form. Marie Antoinette lived in a period of extreme inequality and political instability. The monarchy she belonged to was already under structural pressure long before she became queen. But public frustration rarely targets systems. It targets faces. And she became one of those faces. Over time, her identity was compressed into symbols that were easy to remember and easy to repeat. And "let them eat cake" became the most powerful of those symbols. Because it required no context, no explanation, no historical nuance. Just emotion. And emotion is what survives. Even today, the phrase continues to appear in discussions of inequality, privilege, and political indifference. Not because it is accurate, but because it still communicates something people recognize instinctively. The gap between those who suffer and those who do not. So what is the final answer? Did Marie Antoinette say, "Let them eat cake"? According to all credible historical evidence, no. But the fact that the world believes she did tells us something deeper about history itself. History is not only what happened. It is also what people choose to remember. And sometimes, what they choose to remember is not the truth of a person, but the meaning of a moment. And in that sense, Marie Antoinette's story is not just about a queen. It is about how societies build narratives, how myths are born from crisis, and how a single sentence, true or not, can outlive a lifetime. Even a life as dramatic, controversial, and tragic as hers. Because in the end, she did not become famous for what she said. She became famous for what the world needed her to represent. And that is how a myth survives history. What Marie Antoinette's myth really teaches us about history. Long after the death of Marie Antoinette, the world continued arguing about her. Not about her actions, but about her meaning. Because history did something unusual with her story, it split her into two versions. One was the historical person, A young queen living inside a collapsing monarchy, shaped by political pressure, court expectations, and a rapidly changing nation. The other was the symbolic figure, a distant, indifferent aristocrat who supposedly said, "Let them eat cake," and embodied the cruelty of inequality. And over time, the second version became more famous than the first. This is where historians step in, not to repeat myths, but to dismantle them carefully. Modern historical research consistently shows that the phrase attributed to her has no reliable origin in her lifetime. It does not appear in her personal correspondence. It is not recorded in official court documents. It is not confirmed by credible eyewitness accounts from her contemporaries. Instead, its earliest conceptual roots trace back to earlier European literature, including philosophical anecdotes that predate her political significance entirely. So from a strict historical perspective, the attribution does not hold. But historians do not stop there. Because the more important question is not simply what is true, but why false things become believable in the first place. And this is where her story becomes a case study in collective memory. During the French Revolution, France was not only undergoing political change, it was undergoing emotional restructuring. Old institutions were being dismantled. New systems were being built. And in moments like that, societies search for narrative clarity. Complex systems are reduced into simple characters. Economic collapse becomes personal blame. Structural inequality becomes individual cruelty. And abstract suffering becomes a story that can be told quickly. In that transformation, Marie-Antoinette became a symbol that carried meaning far beyond her actual influence on state economics or policy. She became a narrative container for public frustration. And once that happens, accuracy becomes secondary to emotional clarity. The phrase, "let them eat cake," survived not because it was documented, but because it was useful. It summarized an entire worldview in one sentence. That is why it endured through centuries of retelling, even as historians increasingly rejected its authenticity. And this reveals something important about human memory. We do not preserve history neutrally. We preserve stories that feel structurally satisfying. But satisfaction is not the same as truth. This is why modern historians treat the phrase as a floating myth, a statement without a stable origin that attaches itself to figures who already represent public tension. Marie-Antoinette simply became the most recognizable host for it. And once attached, it rarely detaches. Even today, long after academic consensus has rejected its authenticity, the phrase continues to appear in books, media, and popular discussions. Because myths do not disappear when corrected. They persist because they serve cultural memory. They help people understand inequality. They compress history into something emotionally readable. And they turn complex political collapse into a single human moment. But if we return to the historical figure herself, the reality is more complicated. Marie-Antoinette was not a policy architect of France's economic system. She was not the primary driver of national debt or structural inequality. She was a political symbol placed inside a collapsing system she did not control. And that system, not a single sentence, is what led to revolution. This distinction matters. Because when history reduces entire systems into individual blame, it becomes easier to misunderstand how societies actually change. Revolutions are not caused by one person's indifference. They are caused by long-term structural pressure, political instability, and economic imbalance. Individuals become symbols only after the system is already under strain. So what remains of the myth today? It remains as a warning about how history is remembered. It shows how quickly narrative can override documentation. It shows how propaganda can outlive the political conditions that created it. And it shows how a single phrase, true or false, can become more powerful than the life of the person it is attached to. In the end, Marie Antoinette's story is not just about a queen. It is about memory itself, about how societies decide what to remember, and how easily those memories can shift away from truth toward meaning. So the final conclusion is not just that she likely never said those words. It is that the world needed her to represent them. And once that need existed, the myth became inevitable. Because history is not only written by events, it is written by interpretation. And interpretation is where myth begins. Beyond the myth, why this story still matters today. After centuries of retellings, reinterpretations, and academic corrections, the story of Marie Antoinette has settled into a strange dual existence. On one side, there is the historical record, fragmented, carefully reconstructed, and largely stripped of myth. On the other side, there is the cultural memory, simplified, emotionally charged, and far more widely known. And between these two versions lies the real subject of this story, not a single queen, but the mechanics of how history is remembered. The phrase, "let them eat cake," survives today not because historians support it, but because it continues to function as a symbol. It expresses something immediate and universal, the idea of social distance between those who govern and those who are governed. This is why myths like this do not simply disappear when corrected. They persist because they serve a psychological and cultural purpose. Modern historical analysis consistently shows that Marie Antoinette did not originate the phrase, and there is no credible evidence linking her to it. Instead, it likely evolved from earlier anecdotal traditions in European literature, later attached to her during a period of intense political upheaval. But understanding the correction is only part of the story. The deeper question is why societies repeatedly return to simplified narratives even after evidence contradicts them. The answer lies in how human memory works at scale. Large historical events, especially revolutions, are too complex to be emotionally processed in their raw form. Economic systems, political institutions, and long-term structural inequality cannot be easily visualized or retold in everyday conversation. So they become compressed. And in that compression, individuals emerge as symbols. Marie Antoinette became one of those symbols not because she uniquely shaped the crisis of France, but because her position made her visible at the exact moment when visibility was politically useful. Once that happened, interpretation took over. And interpretation is rarely neutral. It is shaped by urgency, emotion, and the need for narrative clarity. This is why the myth endured even after historians dismantled it, because it is not only a claim about the past. It is a shorthand for inequality in general. And shorthand is powerful. It survives in classrooms, films, speeches, and casual conversation because it communicates a feeling faster than a historical explanation ever could. But there is a cost to that efficiency. When complex systems are reduced to single phrases, understanding becomes simplified to the point of distortion. And when distortion becomes dominant, history becomes less about what happened and more about what is easy to repeat. That does not mean myths are useless. In fact, they often reveal cultural truths that pure factual summaries cannot capture. The myth of "let them eat cake" reflects a real emotional reality of the French Revolution, the perception of extreme disconnect between ruling elites and suffering populations. Even if the sentence itself is not authentic, the feeling behind it is historically real. That is why the myth persists. It carries emotional truth even when it lacks factual truth. This duality is what makes historical memory so complex. It is not simply a record of events. It is a negotiation between evidence and meaning. And Marie Antoinette's story sits exactly at that intersection. A real historical figure, a political symbol, and a long-standing myth layered on top of both. So when we ask again whether she said it, the answer remains consistent. There is no reliable historical evidence that she did. But when we ask why the story still exists, the answer becomes more revealing. Because it tells us how societies remember power, how they assign blame, and how they convert systemic crises into individual narratives. In that sense, Marie Antoinette's legacy is not defined by the phrase itself. It is defined by what the phrase became. A reminder that history is never just about facts preserved in archives. It is also about stories that survive because they feel true, even when they are not. And as long as inequality, political tension, and social division continue to exist, stories like this will continue to resurface in new forms. Different names, different eras, same structure, different symbols. So the final lesson is not about Marie Antoinette alone. It is about how easily history becomes storytelling, and how storytelling, once powerful enough, can outlast truth itself. The truth after all the stories. At this point in the documentary, the story of Marie Antoinette is no longer just about a queen, a revolution, or a single disputed sentence. It has become something larger. A case study in how history is formed, reshaped, and remembered across generations. Because when you strip away centuries of retelling, propaganda, and cultural interpretation, what remains is not a simple answer, but a layered reality. Marie Antoinette lived inside a collapsing political system that was already under extreme financial and social pressure long before she became queen. The French monarchy was not undone by one decision, one speech, or one individual moment of indifference. It was undone by decades of structural imbalance, economic strain, and political rigidity that made reform increasingly difficult. But human memory does not naturally preserve structural explanations. It preserves symbols, and symbols require faces. This is where the phrase, "let them eat cake," becomes historically significant, not as a factual statement, but as a cultural artifact. Modern historians agree that there is no credible evidence she ever said it. The attribution does not appear in contemporary records, verified testimony, or her own writings. Instead, its origins trace back to earlier European anecdotal traditions that circulated long before the French Revolution, later repurposed in revolutionary propaganda and political commentary. Over time, repetition replaced verification. And repetition created certainty. But certainty in cultural memory is not the same as certainty in historical fact. This distinction is one of the most important lessons in studying the past. Because history is not only what survives in archives. It is also what survives in storytelling. And storytelling follows different rules. It prioritizes emotional clarity over complexity. It simplifies systems into individuals, and it compresses long-term processes into short, memorable moments. That is why myths persist even after they are corrected. They are not maintained by ignorance alone. They are maintained by usefulness. The phrase attributed to Marie Antoinette continues to appear in discussions of inequality and privilege because it communicates an idea instantly. It does not require context. It does not require historical study. It delivers meaning in a single line. And in modern communication, that speed is powerful enough to preserve it. But historical understanding requires slowing down that speed. It requires returning to sources, comparing accounts, identifying gaps, and accepting that some of the most famous facts in popular memory are actually constructions shaped by political necessity and cultural storytelling. In the case of Marie Antoinette, the gap between myth and reality is not just about one sentence. It is about how entire identities are formed after the fact. She was a historical person who lived, ruled, and died in a specific political context. But she was also transformed long after her death, into a symbol that represented broader social tensions that extended far beyond her personal influence. That transformation is what history often does. It takes individuals and reshapes them into meaning, and once meaning becomes dominant, it is difficult to reverse. So what does the final truth look like? It is not a dramatic revelation. It is a clarification. She almost certainly did not say the phrase attributed to her. The monarchy did not fall because of a single moment of cruelty or indifference. And the French Revolution cannot be reduced to a single sentence or symbolic figure. Instead, what remains is something more complex, and more useful for understanding history itself. A reminder that systems are more powerful than individuals. Narratives are more memorable than structures. Symbols often outlive facts, and memory is shaped as much by emotion as by evidence. So when people repeat the phrase today, they are not really quoting history. They are quoting a myth that history outgrew, but culture did not forget. And that is where Marie Antoinette's real legacy now lives. Not in what she said, but in what the world needed her to represent. And in that sense, her story is no longer just about the past. It is about how every society, past and present, decides what version of truth it chooses to remember, and what version it chooses to repeat. After the myth, what we do with history now. At this point, the story of Marie Antoinette is no longer expanding in facts. It is expanding in reflection. Because once a historical myth has been fully examined, once its origins, distortions, and cultural persistence are laid bare, the remaining question is not what happened. It is what we choose to do with what we now know. The phrase, "let them eat cake," has already been shown, through historical research, to lack credible evidence tying it to her. But its survival tells us something important about how history functions in the real world. History is not only recorded, it is transmitted, and in transmission, it changes form. The French Revolution itself became one of the most heavily mythologized events in modern history. It was not just a political transformation, it became a narrative template used to explain inequality, revolution, and collapse across different eras. And within that template, Marie Antoinette became a fixed symbolic character. Not because she was the most powerful actor in the system, but because she was the most narratively convenient one. This is where modern historiography makes an important distinction. There is a difference between the historical individual, the symbolic figure, and the cultural myth. All three can coexist in public memory, even when only one is supported by evidence. And that is why correcting a myth does not erase it. It only changes how it should be understood. In academic history, this process is not about debunking in a dramatic sense. It is about restoration, restoring complexity to figures who were flattened by narrative necessity. When historians re-examine Marie Antoinette's life, they are not trying to erase criticism of monarchy or deny the suffering of the French people. They are trying to separate documented reality from symbolic storytelling. Because both exist, but they are not the same thing. And confusing them leads to distorted understanding of the past. The persistence of the "let them eat cake" attribution shows how cultural memory prioritizes emotional clarity. A single sentence can feel more true than decades of economic analysis because it is easier to store, repeat, and emotionally process. That does not make it accurate, but it does make it durable. And durability is one of the most powerful forces in historical memory. This is why myths often outlive corrections. Not because corrections are weak, but because myths are efficient. They compress complexity into narrative form, and humans naturally prefer compressed narratives. So what does this mean for how we understand history moving forward? It means that every well-known historical phrase, quote, or story should be treated as a starting point, not an endpoint. A question, not a conclusion. Because behind every simplified story is a larger system of context that shaped it. And behind every symbolic figure is a real human being whose life cannot be fully captured by the role they were assigned in memory. Marie-Antoinette's case is especially instructive because it shows how quickly political meaning can override documented reality. Once a narrative becomes useful, it can detach from its origin and continue independently. And once it continues long enough, it begins to feel self-evident, even when it is not. So the final lesson of this entire series is not just about one queen or one quote. It is about the structure of historical belief itself. History is not stable. It is negotiated between evidence and interpretation, between record and memory, between what happened and what people agree to remember. And that negotiation is ongoing, even now. So when we revisit stories like this, the goal is not to strip them of meaning. It is to understand where that meaning came from, and what it replaced. Because only then can history become something more than repetition. It can become understanding. And understanding is the only form of truth that survives beyond myth. The last word on a sentence that never happened. At this point, the story of Marie-Antoinette has been told, retold, questioned, dismantled, and reconstructed so many times that it no longer behaves like a simple historical account. It behaves like an archive of how humans process power, suffering, and memory. And that is where this final episode ends, not with new facts, but with final clarity. The phrase, "let them eat cake," which has followed her for centuries, does not survive historical scrutiny as a documented statement. Across surviving records from her lifetime, court documents, correspondence, eyewitness accounts, and revolutionary transcripts, there is no credible evidence that she ever said it. Modern historians consistently trace the phrase's conceptual roots to earlier anecdotal traditions in European writing, where it appeared as a moral illustration of aristocratic ignorance long before the French Revolution. It was already a floating idea before it ever had a fixed owner. And that is the key to understanding how it became attached to her. During the French Revolution, political communication did not function like modern verified reporting. It functioned like rapid narrative warfare. Pamphlets circulated faster than official corrections. Emotion traveled faster than documentation. And symbolic figures were more influential than institutional explanations. In that environment, attribution did not require proof. It required usefulness. And Marie-Antoinette had become useful as a symbol, not because she uniquely caused France's economic crisis, but because she embodied, in public perception, the visible distance between the ruling elite and the suffering population. Once that symbolic role formed, details became secondary, and repetition did the rest. Over time, repetition transformed a metaphor into a quote, and a quote into history. This is one of the most important mechanisms in collective memory. The transformation of interpretation into fact through cultural reinforcement. But this process is not unique to her. It appears in every era where information spreads faster than verification. That is why historians today treat the phrase not as a quotation, but as a case study. A case study in how narratives form, how they stabilize, and how they persist even after being disproven. Because even when evidence is clear, memory is not always governed by evidence. It is governed by meaning, and meaning tends to survive correction. So what remains after all corrections are made? A more accurate, but less simplified, understanding. A queen lived in a collapsing political system she did not control. A revolution transformed that system through violence and restructuring. A symbolic narrative formed around her after her death. And a phrase, likely never spoken by her, became permanently attached to that narrative. That is the historical structure. Not a single moment. Not a single sentence. but a layered process of interpretation over time. And that is the real lesson of this entire story. History is not just about what happened. It is about how what happened is remembered, and how memory reshapes what survival looks like. Marie-Antoinette, in this sense, is no longer just a historical figure. She is an example of narrative gravity, the way public memory pulls scattered facts into emotionally coherent shapes, even when those shapes are not true. So the final answer to the question that started this entire documentary is simple, but important. Did she say it? Almost certainly not. Did people believe she did? Yes, because the story served a purpose larger than accuracy. And does that belief still exist today? Yes, because myths do not vanish when corrected. They fade only when they are no longer useful. Until then, they remain part of cultural language. And so the sentence survives, not as history, but as memory. And that is where this story ends. Not with the quote, but with the understanding that created it. After everything, the silence behind the story, after all the episodes, arguments, and reinterpretations, the story of Marie-Antoinette eventually returns to something very simple. A human life that was turned into a symbol. Not because it was extraordinary in isolation, but because it existed at the exact point where history was breaking apart. She was born into a world already shaped by inherited power, rigid hierarchy, and political imbalance. She entered France not as a creator of that system, but as someone placed inside it, expected to represent it flawlessly while having limited control over its deeper structure. And when that structure began to fail, the weight of failure did not remain distributed across the system. It condensed into names, into faces, into stories that could be repeated. The phrase, "let them eat cake," became one of those stories. Not because it was verified, but because it was memorable enough to carry meaning through time. And meaning, once attached to emotion, becomes difficult to separate from belief. That is why this entire investigation matters. Not because it changes one historical figure, but because it reveals how historical understanding itself is built. Most people do not encounter history as raw archives. They encounter it as compressed narratives, quotes, symbols, and simplified explanations that feel complete. But completeness is often an illusion created by storytelling. Real history is fragmented, uneven, full of gaps, contradictions, and competing interpretations. And Marie-Antoinette's story sits exactly inside those gaps. On one side, documented life, political structure, and verified events. On the other, cultural memory, propaganda, and long-standing myth. Between them, centuries of repetition that gradually blurred the boundary. And so the final truth is not dramatic. It is clarifying. She likely never said the words that defined her in popular memory. But she became attached to them because societies under stress often reduce complexity into emotional shorthand. That shorthand survives because it is useful, not because it is accurate. And once it becomes part of cultural language, it stops belonging to history alone. It belongs to memory, which means it belongs to everyone who repeats it. So the real conclusion of this entire documentary is not about correcting a quote. It is about recognizing a pattern. How quickly individuals become symbols. How easily symbols become myths. And how slowly myths are replaced by understanding. Because even when history is corrected, memory does not immediately update. It lingers. It resists. It simplifies again. And that is why stories like this continue to be told. Not because they are fully true, but because they feel structurally satisfying. And in the end, Marie-Antoinette's legacy is not contained in a sentence she likely never said. It is contained in the lesson her story unintentionally teaches. That history is not only about what is recorded. It is about what survives repetition. And sometimes what survives is not the truth of a life, but the shape that life was given by those who came after it. And that is where the story finally ends. Not with certainty, but with awareness. Not with a quote, but with the understanding that replaced it.